notification. I want to make sure there's not distracting noises. So my name is Melissa Chiovenda, and I did research with civil society activists in Bamiyan, Afghanistan, starting in 2009 and doing the bulk of my research in 2012, 2013, and then making later visits in 2016 and 2019. This is for my PhD in anthropology, and I looked at Hazara collective trauma in the face that everything the Hazara community has faced. I went on to do research with Afghan refugees in Greece, the majority of whom were also Hazara, on political identity. And I worked for 5 years at a university in Abu Dhabi, continuing this research. And for the past year and a half, I moved back to the United States, and I'm working with several organizations that are very much concerned with this topic. One, of course, obviously, is PORSESH Policy Institute for Research. I obviously am connected with this organization. I also work with the Shamama organization that is concerned with recording rights abuses of Afghan women, and the Hazara Resource Platform, which is interested in documenting rights violations of Hazaras. This is kind of not my day job. My day job is I'm currently working as an equity research advisor with the Department of Transportation. I only bring that up because I'm required to say that my views are my own. They have nothing to do with the Department of Transportation. And I'll just get that out of the way. So I'm going to go through an introduction of each of our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to them. I am thinking if the panelists can speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, if possible, not beyond that, just to make sure that we have enough time for audience reflections and questions. So we're very honored to be joined by Sarita Ashraf, who is a senior legal consultant with the US Holocaust Museum's Center for the Prevention of Genocide. She is a barrister who specializes in international criminal law with expertise in gender and intersectional analyses of the same. So currently she's a senior legal consultant to the Center for Justice and Accountability, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, of course, and the Atlantic Council's Strategic Litigation Project. And she also was a primary drafter of a 2023 legal brief advocating for the codification of the crime of gender apartheid in the draft of the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. This is an amazing background for the topic at hand, and I am very interested to hear what she has to say, especially the intersectional aspect of Hazara women and other ethnic minorities in Afghanistan as well, who, I think are suffering from very particular types of discrimination and violence. Then we will hear from Dr. Arif Sahar. He is a researcher at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. His research focuses on international security and terrorism. So Arif has a PhD in political economy of state building in post-2001 Afghanistan from the University College of London Institute of Education. And he has many peer-reviewed articles in academic journals, book chapters, and also has recently had a book come out, or I think it's out already, or it's about to come out. So I think it just came out together with Professor Christian Klaunert. So this is very exciting. He's also founding director of the Kabul-based think tank, the Center for Peace and Development Studies. He's worked as a senior advisor with the previous Afghan government and numerous international development agencies, including the World Bank, UNDP, and the UK Department for International Development. And then we will wrap up with Bismillah Alizada, a PhD candidate at SOAS in London. So his PhD research is focusing on the call for decentralization among Hazaras of Afghanistan between 1992 and 2021. This is seen, I think, as a very important part of Hazara self-determination that is necessary to remedy much of what has been perpetrated against the Hazara community. So it's really important research. So he's looking at decentralization, political settlements, post-conflict institutional design, ethnic politics, and conflict. He holds a Master of Science in Violence, Conflict, and Development from SOAS, and an undergraduate degree in Political Science and Diplomacy from Kabul University. And he's also worked in the past, I mean, these are very impressive resumes, so forgive me. He's worked as Deputy Director at the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies in Afghanistan, working on research, advocacy, and capacity building activities in that organization. And he's also co-edited the third, fourth, and fifth volumes of the organization's peer-reviewed Women in Public Policy journal. He's also co-founded the Rahila organization, which works for youth empowerment. So, again, these are just really great speakers we have. So, again, I just want to briefly give a context about the situation of Hazaras based on my own experience and my own research. I know that a lot of this is going to be very familiar to our audience, but just in case, I want to, set the stage. So historically, Hazaras are a very vulnerable people, both in Afghanistan and outside of Afghanistan. This goes back to their incorporation into the Afghan state, going back to when the Afghan state was formed in the 1700s, but I think the real event that kind of exacerbated this vulnerability was the incorporation of Hazaras, of course, into the Afghan state by King Abdur Rahman in the late 1800s. This series of wars against the Hazara population was so devastating that I believe it can only be called a genocide. There have been a number of efforts for a number of years in various fora around the world, various parliaments, and working with other international bodies to try to have this recognized officially as a genocide. Those efforts are still in progress. I know our speakers have been part of this. I have also been part of these efforts to, testify on behalf of the fact that this was a genocide. And, this is an ongoing effort. So this event in the late 1800s led, of course, to years of marginalization, oppression, and persecution by Hazaras, I should say, of course. Now, I want to jump forward because, of course, that past led to just a long history of over 100 years in the Afghan state of Hazara oppression and persecution, and, rising risk of genocide and at times has perhaps crossed into genocide in the intervening years during what I think we can call the Republican period of Afghanistan, the period after 2001 up to 2021. There were some gains on part of Hazaras, and prior to that as well. But, we really saw kind of a positive upward trajectory. But at the same time, this remained, a very vulnerable group of people in Afghanistan, also in Pakistan and Iran. And as fighting with the Taliban intensified, I think we also saw Hazara vulnerability intensify, and more large-scale attacks against the Hazara community happening up to 2021. Now, want to briefly touch then on the reaction that the Hazara community has had. So during the time that I did the bulk of my research, so, up to, 2012, 2013, I think, we saw within Afghanistan a very vibrant, very strong, what referred to themselves as civil society activist community that were trying to bring attention to this oppression and that were trying to remedy it, seek some sort of recompense, to try to just gain recognition within Afghanistan and beyond of what had happened. And so, you had very active street protests. You had, people who were writing and doing research. You had Hazaras who were, interested in education sector. I mean, both as individuals going to school, but also in, creating schools and universities that were, just flourishing and, providing a space where I think Hazara identity could bloom and try to come to terms with what had happened to them as a people. When large scale attacks kind of started really ramping up. And I think, this started happening around 2011, but really, like, I think 2016 onwards was the mark, right, where we started to see just devastating attacks on Hazaras. I think there was sort of a pulling back from this sort of direct activism on the streets in Afghanistan. A lot of those movements moved online, and we're very vibrant there. We saw, I think, more partnerships with international organizations in an attempt to kind of leverage the possibility of using an international legal system to try to address these issues. And then the Hazara diaspora, which had always been also very much involved, I think kind of stepped up what was happening outside of Afghanistan and really, took on a lot of the burden of what had been done by Afghans or by Hazaras within the country, because there was just too much danger of attack. A protest was bombed in Kabul in 2016, and it was absolutely devastating, the Demazang attack. So this, I think, led to kind of a change in strategy. And that also, I think, continued after 2021, right? We've seen really strong efforts outside of Afghanistan. But interestingly, I would say also kind of a return back to the street protests that I had been doing my research on back in 2012, 2013, although this time largely led by women, because you had this intersection of Hazara vulnerability and the vulnerabilities of women. So movements that were maybe not explicitly labeled as Hazara movements, but that were largely populated by Hazara women, and of course, women from other ethnic groups and some male supporters. And, the women who have done this have been incredibly brave. They have been beaten, they've been detained, they've been killed, they have been suffering sexual violence, and yet we still see them going out on the streets and doing that. So, these are my thoughts just about, kind of what has led to Hazara vulnerability and what has been the reaction. I will turn things over to our first speaker, to Sarita, and take it from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. As my bio suggested, I'm an expert in international criminal law. I aim to be not necessarily an expert in Afghanistan, although my work over the past few years has brought me more and more into contact with the situation in Afghanistan. Given that, I wanted to talk first a little bit about what 2025 may yield in terms of justice options and justice opportunities for the Afghan people, Afghan women and girls in particular, and within that, of course, this Hazara community. After that, I'm just going to speak really briefly about the crime specifically against the Hazara, and the question of genocide and the recognition of genocide and why that is important, and that can be a pathway to other justice options, including transitional justice options. So I want to start off by saying I think 2025 is going to be actually a really important year when it comes to pushing forward on justice options. We have a number of pathways that are becoming clearer. That, of course, does not suggest that justice is necessarily around the corner. Often when we're speaking about international justice in situations which are as challenging as Afghanistan, where a group has taken on territorial control and there hasn't been really any significant attempt to uproot that territorial control, justice is often a marathon rather than a sprint. And I always like to underline that because it is something that people need to ready themselves for, in terms of their energy resources, in terms of their expectations, when they're speaking to other Afghans for the purpose of documentation, to manage those expectations. One thing that I would say is that things can sometimes shift quite rapidly, even when they seem relatively hopeless. I think the experiences of Syria in December, I've worked on Syria for over a decade, and it's something that I think I thought I would never see so quickly. So things can change rapidly, but it is we have to think about it in terms of a long project, knowing that the work that we put in today, the documentation that's done, the advocacy that done, these are the bedrock which increase our abilities to take on openings for justice that may arise even unexpectedly. So I'm going to start today with the International Criminal Court. Afghanistan is, I think, unusual amongst many of the situations that are going on in the world today, in that it does have path to justice, in international criminal justice, through the ICC, which other countries such as Syria and Iraq, Yemen, do not. Iran do not. The Afghan investigation at the ICC has been going on for a very long time. It was restarted after August of 2021 and took on new life with more resources being dedicated to it. We've been expecting the prosecutors' applications for arrest warrants. I'm sure everyone on the call has been for some time, and I know there has been some level of exhaustion and I think concern about the length of time that it is taking. We know that at the end of November of this year, the prosecutor's office received a referral from 6 state parties: Chile, Costa Rica, Spain, France, Luxembourg, and Mexico, expressing their concern about the deterioration of human rights in Afghanistan, especially for women and girls, and asking the prosecutor's office to consider the crimes committed against women and girls inside its ongoing investigation. A day later, the prosecutor had his own press release. It's not unusual, but I would say that the amount of light that he shed on the status of the investigation in a press release was relatively unusual. He welcomed the referring state parties' determination to draw attention to the crimes, welcoming their intervention and their request to his office. And he took time to say that while he emphasized the importance of confidentiality concerning the details of the investigation, he did underline that what he said was considerable progress had already been made in investigating allegations of gender persecution in the situation of Afghanistan. And he was confident that he would soon be in a position to announce concrete results. We were very much hoping that by December we might see the application for arrest warrant, but I'm very hopeful that within the first quarter of 2025, we will see the application for arrest warrants, and I'm certain that they will contain applications on charges of gender persecution, as well as other crimes against humanity. This will be a tremendous moment of pushing forward. It will create a nexus point in the public conversation and the political conversation about what to do for Afghanistan. It's something we need to focus on. There's no indication about whether genocide, which is part of the crimes that fall within the Rome Statute, will be charged. Genocide, and I'll speak a little bit about later, can take longer to evidence because it's a crime of intent. But the one thing I would emphasize is that the applications for arrest warrants, they aren't closed. So you can start off with one set of charges and the prosecutor can continue to add charges. So I think that we should greet the applications when they come out um, with a hope and with using them as an opportunity to raise the profile. And when it comes to the question of really particular issues, if they're not contained in the application for arrest warrants which concern the Hazara, notably the crime of genocide, that is something that if it's not in the in the application for arrest warrants, then it may well be something that could be added later, and it will signal to civil society that this is an issue that the prosecutor's office maybe needs more documentation on, more support on, more conversations with them, between them and civil society. Moving on to the International Court of Justice. So the International Court of Justice, I'm sure many on the call know, differs from the ICC. The ICC is a court of individual criminal responsibility, not too dissimilar from criminal courts in your domestic countries, in the sense they deal with the individuals. The International Court of Justice, sometimes called the World Court, concerns state responsibility. So it's not concerning individuals, it concerns the state and whether the state is living up to its obligations. And those state obligations are against the entire state. They pass from government to government. One of the challenges of the ICJ cases, or the path to ICJ, is there was some fear within the Afghan community that bringing an ICJ case against Afghanistan would result in the either the legitimization or the recognition of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. In fact, what we've seen, and there's some research being done by the Open Society on this, that you can bring a case while still maintaining that the government is not the legitimate government of the country. We see this, for example, in the case of Gambia versus Myanmar. Myanmar, during the course of the case, there was a coup and a junta came to power. Nevertheless, the case is continuing. The proceedings to watch this year will be the promise of Germany, the Netherlands, Australia, and Canada to file a complaint with the ICJ against the Taliban over their increasingly and horrifically oppressive treatment of particularly women and girls. The strategy is to use an overlooked provision in the International Human Rights Treaty and Women's Rights, CEDAW. The states are formally calling on the countries, on the Taliban to cease their violations of the treaty. So it's an immensely interesting case legally. It will provide a tremendous platform in which to delve into how the Taliban treats women and girls and how that affects the society writ large. It is a case, I think, that will revolve around women and girls because it is based on the CEDAW Treaty. However, it provides a pathway to look at how people of different genders in Afghanistan are affected, how even men and boys are cut off from themselves, are harmed by gender oppressive regimes such as have been institutionalized by the Taliban. And it's also a very strong warning that you can be held to account. And we see the ICJ in the last, I would say, 5 years really coming forward and being used to explore some very challenging situations in international law, but also some very devastating human rights situations, as we've seen in the case of Myanmar, in the actions in relation to Israel, in relation to Venezuela. And so this is something that will be also incredibly important and an incredibly central meeting point for those of us who are working on justice. I'm going to mention 3 things much more briefly. The first is around universal jurisdiction. And so when we have pathways to justice that are closed off at international level or where they will only affect a small number of people, universal jurisdiction, which is where you can, where some states allow you to use their domestic courts to have investigations in their domestic courts, even where the perpetrator and victim don't necessarily have a link to the country, and even where the crimes are committed elsewhere. So we've seen, for example, Germany and Sweden really come forward when it comes to cases in Syria and Iran, Syria and Iraq particularly, and in other cases. We've had very successful genocide prosecutions in relation to ISIL crimes in Germany. The first genocide prosecution in relation to an ISIL crime was in Sweden in December. That case closed in December, and we're waiting for the judgment in that case. It can be very empowering, the universal jurisdiction cases, because they really rely on civil society efforts. The Hamdani campaign, based out of Australia, led by Hazaras Mohammed, has put forward a fantastic handbook for Afghan civil society on how to support universal jurisdiction cases, how to be involved in universal jurisdiction cases, to really start pushing forward on domestically in countries which have the laws which will allow it, to start raising these issues. From an advocacy perspective, it's also really important to keep these issues central, not only at the international level, but at the national levels. There's also currently the campaign to codify gender apartheid. I'm sure most of you, hopefully all of you, will have heard of it. There's a website, End Gender Apartheid, and it is working to have gender apartheid recognized as a crime. In fact, Afghan civil society, particularly Afghan women, have been using the term gender apartheid since the 90s. And have been working very hard to have it recognized. The framing of gender apartheid is really important, because what we've seen is there are some crimes, even though there is no hierarchy in crimes, some crimes hold a special kind of power in the political arena. Genocide is certainly one of those crimes. Apartheid is another. That there's a sense of, does a state want to be in contact, want to engage with an apartheid regime? And so the conversation around recognition of gender apartheid as a crime against humanity has really gathered a lot of steam, and there's a tremendous amount of information out there for people to access. And I'm always happy, of course, to speak more about gender apartheid, and would always direct you to the Special Rapporteur on the Situation in Afghanistan's report from June 2024, so half a year ago, in which he explored in more detail the phenomenon of a gender oppressive regime and why it is important to recognize the crime of gender apartheid and then to codify it. As part of that, in the context of that, this conversation around the codification of gender apartheid, recognition of gender apartheid, is part of a bigger conversation around the campaign for a Crimes Against Humanity treaty. A Crimes Against Humanity treaty will be incredibly important, because it not only is about whether a state commits a crime against humanity, but also it imposes obligations on states to prevent and punish the crime against humanity. And I think people often forget that it imposes a legal obligation on states across the board, not just the state where the crime may be happening, but other states as well, to prevent the crime and to punish the crime. And so these are all incredibly important avenues. At the bottom of them is documentation. We no longer exist in a world where, in the world of Nuremberg, where there is, a pyramid at which one court sits at the top. International law now has multiple centers of gravity that coexist, that sometimes support and overlap. And documentation and the education and empowerment of civil society are integral to ensuring that those pathways are used, are seen. For the Hazara community, and I'll round up now because I know I don't want to take up too much time. For the Hazara community, these paths forward are immensely important. First, that they are a community, as you know, that has been persecuted throughout history. If you look at the written record over hundreds of years, you will see persecutions of the Hazara, persecution of those perceived to be outside the dominant power structure. And sometimes that persecution has been horrific, it has been lethal, it has created harms not just to the individual and their family, but it has affected the social bonds of the community, and it has created transgenerational trauma that has rolled down to the children and the children's children, and affected them from everything from health to education to opportunities to belief that justice is possible. When it comes to the Hazara genocide, I always like to say that genocide is not, the most important crime. I don't take the view, and I think it's increasingly that there's no crime that is a particularly worse crime, a crime against humanity and genocide, and one is not necessarily worse than the other. However, I think we would be, naive not to say that the word genocide does have a particular power to it. It's why it is used so much. when we're talking about recognizing the genocide against the Hazara, it's something that is much discussed. I think pushing forward for recognition by states, by pushing the IC prosecutor's office to ensure that genocide is at least as a crime is being investigated. There are discussions ongoing about whether there's enough evidence to put it into the application of arrest warrant. These are incredibly important. What's particularly important, I think, here is to recognize the intersectional nature of crimes. And when we look at genocide, we see that we look at crimes writ large, we see that all of Afghanistan, all the people of Afghanistan are suffering significant crimes which, rise to the level of international crimes, including crimes against humanity. But not everyone is suffering in precisely the same way. And that can cut across gender. Women and girls are suffering in different ways than men and boys, different ways from, for example, non-binary individuals and members of the LGBTI community. You also see differences whether you're in a rural, whether you're from a rural area versus an urban area, whether you're an adult versus if you're a minor, and even within the age of childhood, the situation affects them differently. When it comes to ethno-religious minorities, the Hazara have, the question of Hazara has been seen as particularly urgent because they are so vulnerable to attack and they have so little support within the country for protection, for documentation. And so the situation of the Hazara is urgent and requires, I think, more specialist attention. But within the Hazara community, I would also urge that when we're looking at the crime of genocide, which does, I think, stand as a good descriptor, legal descriptor of what is happening to the Hazara alongside other crimes, we also need to look even at how the crime of genocide is impacting on the Hazara community differently, how the crime of genocide may be committed differently against members of the Hazara community who are older and male versus younger and female, who live in, who are less educated versus more educated. In this way, we understand what genocide, why the crime is designed as it is, why it's being committed as it is, and what the impact of the crime is. And all of this is important not only for taking care of victims and survivors, but also truly understanding the paths to justice which lie in front of us and what it will take to open them further. Thank you. I'll hand back to Melissa now.
Thank you so much. I was trying to unmute myself. So, I mean, this has been a wonderful kind of overview of so many important topics, looking, at the way that international justice mechanisms can be leveraged, hearing from your own experience in Syria and Iraq. And I think what resonated with me was when you said, this is a marathon and not a sprint. I think that can be very frustrating, particularly for people who are suffering from intergenerational trauma and collective trauma. And, this is, always important to keep in mind the very real pain that is suffered. But at the same time, it requires a degree of pragmatism and strategizing that, is also, I think, quite painful when, individuals feel like they're kind of screaming into a void and no one is paying attention. So thank you so much about that. I'm not going to how can I say? I would just be I'm not going to ask for an answer now, but I would be interested when we are moving into the question and answer period, and I just want to say this so that I don't forget. I was very interested in hearing the importance of documentation. Of course, that's something that I'm working together with several organizations. Something that I have been kind of having discussion about is kind of like how to move forward with that documentation and what sort of documentation, whether we're talking about universal jurisdiction or whether we're talking about, international justice mechanisms in multilateral organizations, is what is it that we actually need to collect? Is it testimony of survivors? Like, what are the sorts of things that really, kind of need to be focused on? Is it just, making sure that names of victims are carefully recorded? What is the most valuable? So I just wanted to put that out there. And now we will move on to Arif Sahar, Dr. Arif Sahar, and listen to his presentation. So I'll turn it over to you, Arif. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Sarita, for making really insightful interventions and also presentations. Thank you for providing such a rich contextual assessment and analysis of the Hazara people's struggles for rights and justice in Afghanistan. So I've been researching the topic for a number of years now. What I'm trying to understand is how the Hazara people in Afghanistan have tried to understand, to interpret, and to respond to their conditions amid an international intervention which provided a window of opportunity for everybody, particularly for the Hazaras, to come to terms with their past, the history, and also make sense of their interactions and participation within the broader political spectrums, both informal and informal settings. But I'm also very much interested in understanding this peace pedagogy, peace education, and how the Hazaras have tried to build upon these opportunities to address their conditions and to build a new narrative that resonates with their aspirations and also that connects their past to their present and takes their present forward to the future. I've been utilizing on a set of theories from different fields and different backgrounds, including political economy, political science, with a particular focus on epistemic injustice theory that comes from Marinda Africa, and also peace education, critical rights, literacy. So what I found quite interesting in doing this research is that these theories, whilst they are very powerful, they resonate quite a lot with the Hazara people's experiences, but unfortunately they have not been used quite a lot. So this is an opportunity and a space to get ourselves exposed to these new theories, which would enable us to have a critical look at all these events and also to scrutinize the Hazara people's experiences and also their aspirations for the future in a more systematic and in a more innovative way. So in terms of how the Hazaras have sought to respond to their conditions, so there are three main areas that I would like to bring to attention today. So these are the main areas that I've been working on. I know there are lots of other areas and fields that colleagues have been working on. They are equally important, but my area of research at the moment revolves around these three themes. So the first one is civil activism. Civil activism is a very strong and a very rich mechanism and a means to responding to difficult conditions. It is not just in the context of Afghanistan, it's not just in the context of the Hazara community, but around the globe, civil activism plays a key role in bringing different people together, in facilitating communication, interaction, and also in facilitating a contextual assessment and also a contextual interpretation of the tensions, grievances, and also the aspirations that different layers of communities would seek to achieve. I've been doing a comparative study in the context of Afghanistan and the Hazara struggles for rights and justice. I've been focusing on the Enlightenment movement, and I've been doing a comparative analysis between different international organizations which engage in civil activism. So but I've been studying the Madhesh movement in Nepal. I've been studying the democratic movement, the Kurdish democratic movement in Turkey. And also I've been studying the Housing Assembly in South Africa. Whilst these organizations, whilst these movements operate at the national and international level, whilst the Enlightenment movement mostly focused or mostly drew its roots from the Hazara community, but there are some critical similarities and also overlaps that we might be able to cross-fertilize to understand how the Hazara people are understanding, interpreting, and responding to their conditions. In terms of the civil activism, there are a number of key features that the Enlightenment movement displayed or projected at the national and the international level. It is not just exclusively limited to the Enlightenment movement. The Hazara civil society has been relatively active, and the overall civil activism culture has been inclusive. So it has included people from different backgrounds, regardless of their socioeconomic backgrounds and gender identities. So it has tried to overcome the barriers that are quite dominant in the traditional civil activism of civil society. The Hazara activism has been quite critical. It has been critical in multiple fronts and at multiple levels, targeting different actors, organizations, societies, structures, and also the dominant political discourses and narratives. The Hazara activism has not only criticized or critiqued the dominant traditional power structures, but it has also criticized the Hazara aspirations and also their activities, their leadership, their politics, their society, their organizations, actors, and political parties, and the ways in which they tried to project themselves at the national and international level. The other main feature of the Hazara activism is that it is quite widespread. It is quite diverse. It covers a wide range of geographical landscapes. It does not limit itself within the Hazara communities per se, but it also tries to talk, to discuss, and to connect with other organizations, similar organizations, with other similar actors and other layers of communities. It tries to forge a narrative that bridges the gaps between different communities, and it also tries to create a shared narrative, a shared platform, and a shared agency to enable all these civil society activists and actors and platforms and agencies together to fight for shared and common objectives such as peace, justice, and social equality. The Hazara civil activism has been relatively reflexive. So it has tried to understand the broader context, to forge the means and the vehicles that speak directly to the grassroots communities, to the grassroots actors. And also it has tried to localize the knowledge that it creates and recreates. So the Hazara civil activism has been a process of learning, de-learning, and relearning civil activism at different levels. When we talk about this reflexivity and also about this feature, so it has been quite unique in terms of bringing women onto the platform and giving them the space, giving them the agency to project themselves at the national level. One of the key features of the Enlightenment movement was the fact that it tried to navigate gender biases, gender inequalities, and also gender discriminations. Well, my study, my research from other cases that I highlighted earlier suggests is that these gender inequalities are the main source of gender discriminations, gender injustices, and also the perpetuation of gender inequality and discriminations and injustices. Based on that, I have written an article which is coming out next month. In the article, what I'm trying to understand is is, or perhaps its title as the gender dimensions of the armed conflict in Afghanistan and education. So what I'm trying to understand is how the gender dimensions of the armed conflict in Afghanistan affect this gender inequality, gender discriminations, and also gender identities, and how, under such circumstances, civil activism can provide us with a tool to overcome these challenges. Last not least, another key feature of the Hazara civil activism has been its intersectionality. I think in a context like Afghanistan, that is relatively exclusive, where people are living in different security and ethnic-oriented boxes. Promoting the idea of intersectionality is quite significant because it gives you the opportunity and the base and the ground to forge trust, to forge confidence, and also to bring different people with different aspirations on a common platform where common agenda, common narrative, and a shared value can be forged, can be constructed, can be fought for. So the idea of intersectionality is quite important, and it provides a significant leverage that we could build on. And also the other means that the Hazaras have been trying to leverage to respond to their condition is political participation. What my research suggests is that in the context where there are different ethnic groups or different social groups, different identity groups in contestation, in confrontation with each other, political participation provides as a means an opportunity not to build a new identity, but also to gain new agency, to effect change, to effect transformation, and also to bring about change, to create a space where different people come together, where different people, different organizations and actors can interact and communicate with each other. And also, my research suggests that from the Hazara perspective, political stability would be the first and the most critical, the most important step forward. But that's why the Hazaras have tried to support all sorts of political participation, as the Hazaras would definitely benefit the most under political stability and lasting and sustainable peace. So given that, and also looking through a cost opportunity calculation, the Hazara people would support political participation, equal political participation, or just political participation, not just for themselves and also for the other ethnic communities and social groups as well, because together they thought they were together in this, and together they could move forward. So it wouldn't be able. So it would not be possible or feasible or effective or efficient enough for the Hazaras alone to take the entire responsibility for building peace. So they tried to make it a participatory process. So within this, I'm using two key terms to describe the Hazaras. Took a very proactive role, and also they tried to take a coactive role, where they tried to involve and engage other actors as well to strengthen their cause. The last area, or the last area of focus, area of research that I've been working on is education. So the Hazaras resorted to education in the post-2001 context as a means of liberation, as a means of freedom, as a means of independence. And the Hazaras tried to use educational opportunities, both informal and informal settings and education, formal settings and institutions, to build a new narrative to improve their social status and also to improve their economic leverages. The Hazaras resorted to education not just as a simplistic means of socioeconomic improvement, but also to exact revenge against their oppressors. And also the Hazaras utilized education as a means of resistance. So it was one of the most powerful means of vehicles of resistance against their conditions. But as I said, education again was perceived by the Hazara community as a whole as a means of liberation, as a means of freedom, and a vehicle to effect change in Afghanistan. So these are the main areas that my research currently focuses on. And I think they sync and link to the other people's struggles for rights and justice in Afghanistan. And also, these are the ways how they have been trying to organize for peace and justice over the past 25 or so years. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Arif. So just briefly while you were talking, I was just reflecting on how much this sort of overview, a sort of top-down overview of Hazara civil society and Hazara activism, reflected on my ethnographic work with Hazara civil society. I think of the people I worked with in Bamiyan as kind of a precursor to the enlightening movement. In fact, many of them were part of that movement once it took that name. And I was just thinking it would be really interesting if we could write an article or something that would somehow bring together that ethnography and then that this kind of top-down theoretical narrative, because I think it's just two different views of the same thing. If you feel like responding, again later on, something that seemed really interesting to me, and forgive me as an anthropologist, but I'm always quite interested in the position of the researcher. And so I would just be, kind of interested to hear about your own experience as, a member of this community and a member of this activist community. And I would dare to say also, someone who has yourself, I would guess, and forgive me if I'm overstepping, but perhaps yourself used education as a means of liberation, as you said, right? Because I mean, you're a scholar, you're an academic yourself. I would be interested in this. I've also kind of thought a lot about my own positionality as a researcher, as an outsider who kind of slowly moved into more of an activist role, and then in 2020 2021 kind of really have more fully occupied that position, especially now that I've left my academic appointment, and so what I'm doing with Afghanistan is really kind of teetering between, which side am I on? And I would just really be interested to hear your thoughts as someone coming from the community. So thank you so much. That was a very, very fascinating and insightful talk. All right, so I will now turn over to Bismillah Alizada, and let's listen to his talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Melissa. Well, honestly, as I was speaking to the previous panelists as they were talking, I was also reflecting on how difficult it is to do research on a topic that is so close to one's heart, but also that is sort of like that has for quite a long time affected people very closely and very personally. So the topic is also very personal to so many people, and I'm included in that list. In 2016, Dr. Sahar talked about the Enlightenment movement. I was among the people who was wounded in that attack. And then later on, in like a year and a half, or like almost 2 years after that, Rahila was among the people who was killed in the attack on Maud course, on Maud Education Center, and Rahila was a distant cousin of mine. So, there are like different layers of how all of these different episodes of violence have affected people personally. So doing research on this is becoming extremely personal and extremely difficult at times, and very taxing in terms of mental health and those things. But anyways, so basically I will focus on a recent article that it's not an article in that sense, but it's just a piece that I wrote for Itilaat Rose. It's in Persian, and it was focusing on 9 trends of human rights violations against the Hazaras under the Taliban regime. I'll basically try to keep my focus around those 9 trends of human rights violations, and then try to expand to also include the historical, sort of like socio-political historical context in which these crimes are happening and these trends are perpetuating. Now, one is the genocidal violence, as I characterized, which is that as far as I have identified and documented, over the past 38 months, as many as 61 attacks have taken place against the Hazaras. All of them on soft targets, civilian targets against the Hazaras in Afghanistan. As a result of these 61 attacks, 473 people have been killed and 681 people have been wounded. Now, this is a very staggering sort of number, because on average, this means that every 3 days, one person was killed, and every 2 days, one person was wounded in the past 3.5 years or so under the Taliban regime. Now, so many people and so many organizations have characterized so far these attacks in terms of the crimes of genocide. And so many others have avoided using that term, but have rather, like put their focus on other terms like crimes against humanity and so on. So, thinking about what has happened and thinking about how we can frame it and understand it, one can wonder why, there is this division in advocacy that we have in terms of like how we understand the violence that's happening against the Hazaras. We know that it's systematic, and we know that the trends of these attacks speak volumes in terms of like the nature of these attacks. But anyways, I will later try to explain what I think about the nature of these attacks and what needs to be done in terms of research. But now the next trend is Kuchi attacks. Kuchi attacks have been there for quite a while now, and it's a century-old sort of phenomenon that's been happening ever since the formation of the Afghan state in the late 19th century. And ironically, the Kuchis were rewarded lands and pasture lands in Hazarajat and rights to pasture lands in Hazarajat for sort of contributing in the attacks against the Hazaras and like joining the coalition with the central state in that war. And ever since, they have tried to keep that prize by continually attacking places within Hazarajat in the spring and summer season. So over the past 38 months, Kuchi attacks have also been surging. And Kuchi attacks have involved loss of life in so many cases, because there are, numerous cases of Kuchis attacking with like Kuchis going to Hazarajat armed, in some cases heavy arms, And the confrontations then lead to loss of life. And so many people have been wounded and maimed and properties damaged. But under the Taliban, there has also been cases of extortion of the Hazaras, Hazara villagers, because now the Taliban and the Kuchis, they have found something common, which is that the Taliban actually support the Kuchis in their claims against the Hazaras, and then the adjudication process is in a way that interests the Kuchis more than the Hazaras. So there has been many cases of extortion of the Hazaras, and this is in hundreds of lakhs of Afghanis, which is like tens of millions of Afghanis, as far as it's recorded. But of course, so much of it goes unreported because of all that's going on in the country. There has also been many cases of, fruit-bearing trees that have been cut. And thinking of genocide, this may be extremely important as to the means of livelihood of a particular community being destroyed. So that may speak volumes in terms of the intent, as Sarita was talking about, why genocide is a crime of intent, and that's of course important. Another trend has been forced eviction in many places. Forced eviction have happened. Hazaras have been collectively evicted from their lands under the Taliban. 5 or 6 cases of these evictions have been documented by human rights reporters, including Richard Bennett, the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Afghanistan. So another trend has been de-recognition of the Shia faith. So the Hazaras, for quite a long time, struggled to recognize the Hazara, for their faith to be recognized within the constitution in Afghanistan. In 2004, when the constitution was ratified finally after a lot of backs and forths, that recognition was granted, and there was this Shia jurisprudence that was applied in personal status cases, but that has been de-recognized by the Taliban now. And pursuant to that, the Shia jurisprudence has been excluded from the curricula at school and also at the university levels. And all of the Shia judges have been fired en masse. And now the personal status cases of the Hazaras are being adjudicated if they're taken to the court. And of course, in so many cases, people don't take those to the courts. But if they're taken to the courts now under the Taliban, and courts, quote unquote, those will be adjudicated according to the Hanafi jurisprudence, which is against their faith, against the faith that they practice. And I mean the Shia Hazaras, of course. There has also been restrictions on religious events and celebrations, and in many cases, pressure for conversion. Ismaili Hazaras, in particular, have been pressurized by the Taliban to convert to Hanafi Islam, and many cases have been reported in Badakhshan province specifically. There has also been this trend of collecting religious taxes from the Shia Hazaras, which goes against their belief. So there is like effectively paying taxes against their belief. Cultural exclusion has been another trend over the past 3.5 years, which includes ban on religious books of the Shias. Many of the books have been thrown into the river, have been destroyed, have been taken, both from shops where the books were sold and from the border points. And also books on the history of Hazaras and the identity of the Hazaras and the Tajiks, they've been banned. So publishers are not allowed, publishers in Afghanistan are not allowed to publish those books, and there's a long list of those books. And booksellers are not allowed to sell those books in the market. There has also been reports of discrimination in distribution of humanitarian aid and development programs. This has been sort of like, a long cry from the Hazaras, and it has a longer history, of course. But there has been numerous reports from different organizations, including CIGAR and other human rights organizations, of course, who have documented this. And expunging from the political and administrative system, there has been cases of en masse firing of Hazaras from various government institutions, including in places where Hazaras are dominant, the majority, like in Bamiyan and in the Daikondi provinces, for example. In Bamiyan and Daikondi and some other places where Hazaras, Shia Hazaras are the majority, in the Ulama Council, which is the Religious Clerics Council, all of the members have been appointed non-Hazara, non-Shia, mostly members of the Taliban, actually, or people who are very close to the Taliban. So these have been like, these 8 and 9 trends of human rights violations against the Hazaras in the past 3.5 years. Now, I would like to also add a few points in terms of how we should understand it, how we understand it, and then I'll finish there. First of all, I think multiplicity of crime is extremely important to note and to focus. Because when we focus so much on genocide, specific crimes that have happened against the Hazaras may fall under the category of genocide. But there's so much more happening when it comes to the situation of Hazaras in Afghanistan, and not necessarily all of them fall under the category of genocide or the crime of genocide. So it's important to recognize and important to focus on this multiplicity of crimes that's happening against the Hazaras. Some of these can be crimes against humanity, some of them can fall under many other different crimes. But it's important to keep in mind that the advocacy and the research shouldn't be focused on either it is genocide or it's not genocide. That sort of either or formulation is, I think, is oversimplifying the complex situation that's going on in the country. And another thing that's important here, and I would like to underline, is the fact that framing is very important. So I think genocide, if we go according to the definition of the Rome Statute, and specifically Article 6 of Rome Statute, and of course the earlier Prevention of Genocide Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, I think much of what has happened in terms of the attacks against the suicide attacks and the violence against Hazaras fulfill nearly all of the criteria for the definition of genocide. So the way that we frame is extremely important. But again, I emphasize that so much more, like case of eviction, for example, and so much more of what has happened to the Hazaras and continues to happen do not fall necessarily under that particular category of crime. So again, framing and multiplicity should be taken into account when we are trying to understand this and when we are researching this. Also, when we talk about the crime of genocide, so much has been done to focus on the crime of genocide from a very narrow perspective of international law. I think international law is important, and, taking the perpetrators to justice within the frameworks that we already have is important. But understanding genocide beyond international law is also important. And there's so much more to genocide than the international law and then the definition of the Rome Statute. And the theories of genocide, the rather newer theories of genocide, shed light on a lot of other, nuances in this phenomenon. And that will help us understand it much more comprehensively. Um, and the colors and the nuances that may not necessarily be captured under the definition of the Rome Statute. It's also important to keep in mind the social, historical, and political context against which all of these that's happening against the Hazaras is taking place. So it's, not like nearly all of these things have historical roots that goes back decades, if not centuries. Now, that power dynamics is extremely important to factor in when we try to understand each and every one of these trends that's going on within the Hazaras. Now, in terms of history and genealogy of each of these trends, now I would like to just add a few more findings from another research that I and a few other friends of mine did, which is not yet published. But the findings of that research shows that from 2002 until 2021, until the end of 2021 and early 2022, we identified as many as like nearly 300 attacks against the Hazaras in that period of time. Now, the attacks, of course, as Dr. Melissa also noted, started from 2010 and 11. In 2010 and 11, of course, the attacks in Nowruz, in Kabul and Mazar-e-Sharif, the beginning of those attacks. But even before that, there were attacks. There were other forms of violence against the Hazaras, including attacks by Kuchis that peaked, for example, in years like 2007 and 2008. One of the biggest demonstrations of the Hazaras in Kabul was at that time, when there was a huge Kuchi onslaught in Behsud in Hazara and parts of Hazarajat. Now, another form of violence has been the violence in the highways, cutting off the Hazarajat from the rest of the country, particularly the capital, because Hazaras were like traveling from Bamiyan and from Ghazni through the highways to Kabul, and they were arrested on the highways, in many cases kidnapped and abducted, and then killed. Or there were cases of them being killed in the worst cases, being slaughtered by kite strings and those extremely horrendous forms of torture. Now, over this period, 2,228 people have been killed, as far as we've been able to document, and 2,837 people have been wounded. Now, it's important to emphasize on this because so the general framing is that the past 2 decades of the Republic was a golden time for the Hazaras. Now, framing it in that way, that the past 2 decades was a golden time for the Hazaras, it's oversimplification of how the situation was for the Hazaras. Because, of course, Hazaras tried to utilize some of the opportunities that were available. And of course, there were discriminations in those opportunities as well, but they tried to utilize those opportunities. But at the same time, they were, enduring a lot of violence. And majority of the attacks in the list that we have tried to put together, we think fulfill the definition of genocide. And almost all of them fulfill the definition of crimes against humanity. So that's why I think this historical genealogy of each of these trends and the framing is important. But here I would also like to add a caveat, which is that quantification, I did mention numbers, but I think quantification is extremely tricky, given how difficult this is, and given that each of the case had not been documented in time in the best way possible. So it's difficult. It has its own pitfalls, of course. And also that qualitative research is needed. Much more qualitative research is needed really to understand these trends and these attacks. At the same time, I think the narratives and the discourses around these trends is also very important. I'm mindful of how long I've taken, so that's why I'm trying to be very short. But just to focus on a few questions, why is there a denial? Because generally from outside the Hazaras, the dominant sort of reaction has been denial. So why is there a denial, and what does denial speak to the complex dynamics of ethnic relations in Afghanistan and power relations and power dynamics, and things like that? And what does it mean for us, for example, who are interested in documenting these attacks and interested in trying to advocate for an end to these attacks and advocate for justice? How do we and should we understand it? These are a few questions I think that are extremely important. And last but not least, what should be done? Well, we, like for us who've been trying to do some documentation and some research, I think it's extremely under-researched. So we know that so much has happened, but we know that it's not documented enough. Now, generating and curating an evidence base is extremely crucial, I think. Some of the organizations have been trying to do that, but I think it's not sufficient enough. So we need to do more, in order for us to have a comprehensive sort of like database of sorts, or an evidence base, so that researchers can use those evidence base, to produce research on this. And at the same time, advocacy and utilization of existing avenues for justice in the international level. Now we know that, of course, the ICC, for instance, is one of those avenues. Some of our friends in some of those efforts I've been included have tried to work with the ICC to put pressure and to provide assistance to ICC in order for some of these crimes to be investigated. But much more is needed to be done. And there is, of course, limitations and challenges, I think, given the situation in Afghanistan right now and the issue of access and confidentiality and no harm and all of that. Sarita talked about it in details. So it's so tough and so complex and so much in fact to be done. But I hope that all of these small steps that we're taking can continue, and we have more people joining us as we go forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bismillah. I really appreciate the points you made. The call for qualitative documentation, I think is very important. in part because this is the way I work, but I think it's very powerful. I'd be interested. I mean, I think this brings us back full circle to, the question to Sarita about, what can we do as researchers and what kind of documentation, is most valuable, and, the problems with numbers that you rightly point out exist. Also, this question of, genocide definition under international law, which is pragmatically what we have to work with within these institutions, but, which I think pretty much everyone that works on genocide and atrocity prevention recognizes, is, I don't know if arbitrary is the right word, right? But comes out of a particular historical circumstance and, maybe doesn't accurately describe, current situations or all situations. And yet that word has so much power that that's how, you can really kind of move people. Also, just two tiny things I just wanted to pull out. The point of fruit-bearing trees, I think, is just kind of really interesting to underline if you think about the situation of Palestinians and their olive trees and the symbolic power that has had, and the kind of beautiful symbolism of like almond trees in Daikundi, for example, right? And these sorts of messages are hard trending, but I think can be very powerful. And then finally, I would just be interested. I know probably we don't have time, so probably I should just talk to you at some other point, but I would be quite interesting, again, bringing us back to this question of intersectionality and thinking about the intersection of Hazara and Shia faith and also women's issues. I early on, was kind of following what was going on with Shia leadership in Afghanistan. And if I remember, I believe Ayatollah Wais Besudi initially was kind of trying to work with the Taliban to help the community. And this stood out to me because I was lucky enough to meet him on several occasions and talk to him early on in my research. And that he kind of made this demand that women issues be approached differently by the Taliban than they were being early on, and that this kind of sidelined him. And I don't know what has happened with the Shia leadership since then. So, that was also something, where, we can kind of come back to this theme of intersectionality on these points and try to think about it. Anyways, I want to ask our speakers, does anyone have a hard stop on time that you need to leave? Or would it be possible to add on maybe 15 more minutes or so to the end? If you have a hard stop, I want to see if there's any questions for specific speakers, like right now. Otherwise, we have some really important academics who have done amazing work in the audience, who I think would also like to contribute their thoughts and perspectives on this talk, and I'd like to open up to them. So let me just ask that question. Does anyone have a hard stop? Is it okay to add on a few more minutes?
Go on for 15 more minutes.
15 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if Sarita is not in a rush, we might be able to hear from Dr. Akbar as well,
Okay.
who wishes to contribute. Thank you.
And
Perfect.
Sarah has her hand up as well.
Yeah, so let's hear from Dr. Akbar, and then after that, I'll ask Maisa Miltaf as well, because I know that he had also communicated to me that he had some thoughts. So perfect. That sounds like a plan. Thank you.
Can I go? Yeah, hello, salam, everyone. Sorry I was rushing because it's very late night here in Melbourne, but very fascinating discussion. Thank you very much, PORSESH, for putting together this very, very insightful discussion on a very unrecognized and acknowledged topic, and also very grateful to hear the speakers, Dr. Melissa, soon to be Dr. Alizada, and dear friend Sarita, and also Dr. Sahar, about your great contribution on this topic. I think what you have provided, the context tonight, and your analysis is really, really helpful for us as researchers to be able to find our own grounds on this very important topic, coming back to genocide and Hazaras vulnerability in the Taliban rule. I wanted to share a couple of anecdotes and maybe a question or two to the panelists generally. My anecdote was hearing the panelists speaking. I think from my own research as well, and what you have mentioned is that there's a lack of recognition of the Hazaras vulnerabilities in real sense in the Afghan politics right now. And this is not only the Taliban, but also the advocacy work that is going on outside the country. There has been some references of the Hazara minority or the minority, but with so much sensitivities around it in the special human rights rapporteur's reports. And even today, we do not have a single report on the vulnerability of Hazaras inside Afghanistan by the United Nations or any other officials from the UN or even the state, let alone anything else. So whatever knowledge that has been produced is what Hazara researchers have been writing about. And as my dear friend Bismillah Alizada has been pointing out about the lack of evidence, and this is what we are struggling. I mean, how far can we go as researchers to really provide that evidence when there is no resources, no dedicated research, no state, like in the last 20 years, the whole effort was put into state building and nation building of building that common identity and neglecting and silencing that vulnerability, which we knew it existed. And now 3 years on, and here are us scattered in diasporas in different countries and trying to patch into what we have, and this is not enough. And one more, I think lack of evidence-based research is missing, and we need, apart from our own work as researcher, we need efforts from the international community to support it. And secondly, what I did not hear tonight was the vulnerabilities of Hazara women in the gender apartheid. We talked about CEDAW, we talked about gender apartheid, we talked about intersectionality. I think, and that's because there's no evidence about the vulnerability of Hazara women and the sexual violence that is going on against the Hazara women inside Afghanistan under the Taliban rule. And here I think we are talking about a much more bigger problem that sort of links back to this lack of support, lack of evidence, and lack of recognition that we need to speak about. I think as a Hazara researcher, for me, the priority would always be how to build evidence about it. And we need support for this. We are there, we want to speak. We have local journalists, we have people on the ground, but we need support on how to bring this on and create that evidence in a standard international level that is recognizable and can be codified under the genocide documentation and apartheid documentation. Sorry, I took too long, and I know it's very late.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khanda. I think that's an excellent point. It's been slow going when it comes, I think, to this question. I feel like just a few years ago, no one was even acknowledging the issue of the particular vulnerability to, sexual violence and other gender discrimination issues as well that Hazara women face. Now there is an acknowledgement, but like you say, there's just, given that it has been sort of covered over. There's not been the evidence. I know that for many this is a work in progress, both trying to document what has happened historically, and sometimes, well, there is kind of a literature on people who try to document through silences and through what has been unsaid a very specific collective trauma. But of course, that's trying to document a void is difficult. So I mean, this is a great point. I do think that Richard Bennett is working on this issue right now. I have been working kind of slowly with several organizations as well, to some women, but I would love to hear what others have to say on this topic, because you're absolutely right.
Can I just add, Melissa? Richard is working. We have, as a community, we have spoken to Richard, but his work is on Afghanistan overall, and he does not have a mandate to make a report about the violations of or vulnerability of Hazaras inside Afghanistan, and that makes it difficult for him. And on other hand, because of the restriction inflicted, we cannot provide that documentations. So here, the most important part is to advocate for a mandate that we could ask Richard or anyone at the UN to provide a report on vulnerabilities of Hazaras inside Afghanistan under the Taliban rule.
Let's hear from Sarita and then Bismillah on this topic.
Thank you. Just a couple of things in response. First of all, just to know for the audience, I put in 2 links in the chat. The first is a handbook to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum's handbook for pursuing justice for mass atrocities for victims groups. And I think it's really important, because what that handbook underlines is that documentation is important, but being trained to do documentation is also incredibly important, because you can re-traumatize, you can actually contaminate documentation practices through poor practices, and that is a good guide for different victims groups, survivor communities, to think about how do we want to interact, because there are lots of ways in which they can collect information, certain types of information, for example, lists of the missing, list of those who've been killed, families which don't require them, for example, to put themselves in a room with someone who suffered trauma and try and take a statement if they're not trained to do that. I've also included the Hamdali campaign's handbook for universal jurisdiction, which I think is coming out in Pashto and Dari. I don't know if it's out yet. Farah would probably know faster than I would. In terms of the genocide definition, I would really emphasize that in some ways you don't need documentation of the underlying crimes, because genocide is a crime of intent. A lot of it can be done through OSINT, through looking at the behavior of, Taliban, ISKP, looking at statements, judgments, and then pulling out. So getting the nitty-gritty around sexual violence, around speaking to people who are in difficult to reach areas. Actually, I mean, obviously, if you were building a prosecution case for trial, you would need to get to those people. To do a genocide analysis, you don't necessarily need to pull those people's and create protection concerns, because what you're really looking for is the intent, and a good analysis of the intent. 2 more things from me. One, I don't agree that Richard doesn't have the mandate. Richard has a wide-ranging mandate. It relates to all Afghanistan. And of course, he couldn't do an official report in the same way as the June report on institutionalized systems of gender oppression, but he could do what's called a conference room paper. And that would allow them, it would be a special paper, it would be extra work, it wouldn't get translated into all the UN languages, but it is something that he can do. Where there is a gap, and where I think the Special Rapporteur Richard and others could be very supportive, is pushing towards having some sort of fact-finding mission or commission of inquiry on Afghanistan, because they play an integral role in collecting documentation, in liaising with civil society, in doing quarterly reports. In this, I think the real model that people may want to look at is the Commission of Inquiry on Syria and how it dealt with the crimes against the Yazidis. The Commission of Inquiry on Syria was set up in 2011. It did the 6-monthly reports on all of Syria, but it also then started doing what a conference room papers, CRPs, which is done enforced disappearance on sieges. And one of the CRPs that they did was in June of 2016, which was a deep dive into ISIS crimes against the Yazidis, which was the first, well, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum did the first report making a finding of genocide, but it was the first UN report making a finding of genocide. And that report, because it was a legal analysis, because it came with a stamp of the UN, even though it was a CRP and not an official report, kicked things off down the road, which led to recognition by states. And personally, I don't think we would have had UNITAD, which is the UN investigative team in Iraq, looking at crimes by ISIS, unless we'd had that June 2016 CRP because it entered the conversation to a new level. So when it comes to the genocide, when the Hazara, it receives, I think, a lot of attention within the community. It's discussed a lot. There's academic articles on it. But what you will need is less analysis from inside the community. It's very important, but in terms of getting it into an international things, what you really need is a legal analysis. So not something which is more advocacy based, but a straightforward, hardline legal analysis focusing on intent coming out of potentially US Holocaust Memorial Museum, but really something like either Richard's office or OHHR, or as part of the work of a not yet established Commission of Inquiry or fact-finding mission. That is something that will take the conversation about genocide and crimes to a new level. And I think it's something that I think you could do with Holocaust Museum now, but certainly with Richard's office if they're willing to do a conference room paper. And I would really encourage the Hazara community to, and I know it's happening already, but to reach out to other communities where there has been more of a finding around genocide and really learn from the experiences of others. The Yazidi community, I think, would be really helpful. They're an ethno-religious minority. They were in a situation where they were often inside an area where you couldn't reach them because they were held inside the caliphate. And speaking about how their advocacy worked and what they think was a good thing to spend time on in retrospect versus not a good thing to spend time on, where they thought that the allyships that mattered most within, for example, UN systems, international systems, what was good to spend time on and what wasn't. Same to a lesser extent, I think, for the Uyghur community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bismillah, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, very, very quickly, just trying to highlight that I personally, like when I talk about documentation, I personally mean documentation for the purpose of human rights and legal things, but at the same time, documentations that can be used across disciplines just for understanding what's going on. So we focus so much on documentation. I mean, like people who've been working on the issue of the Hazara, the genocide, and all of the other crimes. We've tried to document it in a way that may cater the need for example, recognition of genocide before an international organization, or that may suit, for example, human rights advocacy and those things, right? But there hasn't been much documentation done to be used across disciplines to help us, gain a deeper, more nuanced, more comprehensive understanding of the phenomenon itself. So I think it's very useful to reflect on what we can do to expand the scope of documentation and the types of documentation that we do, and whether there's resources or whether there's synergy that can be done in order for that sort of documentation also to be achieved.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think these are all really important points to address the question of, what we can do moving forward as researchers, as activists, as supporters of the Hazara community. So, I mean, thank you both to Sarita and to Bismillah. These are such valuable pieces of advice and resources that have been given to us. I know that Sarita may have to leave, and maybe others might have to leave. I want to thank anyone that does have to leave now. I want to again, thank you so much for joining. I'm gonna ask my son Iltaf if he wants to say anything at this point. I think he's here. Hope. My son, are you here?
I hate to interrupt, but could I just have Sarita resend that link? And because I was interested, I posted in the let me turn my camera. I reposted on the chat that I would be willing to connect with some of you. Melissa, I actually was conducting my research on the Hazara, as I mentioned, and I would love to get your email or so we can chat. I just felt like it was pretty ironic. You were in the meeting and I was doing the research, so I was like, wow. So if you would be open to.
Yeah, I took down your email, but I'll also put mine up. So yeah, we should definitely connect. We should definitely connect. And I took out those resources so I can just try to send them to you as well. If or maybe I can repost them as well in the chat too.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
All of your help. This is really fascinating. So I appreciated this.
Yeah, you're welcome. I agree. It's been a great event. I don't know if my son left. Does he's not here.
He did leave a note actually.
He did. I've been trying to follow and I'm doing too many at once. That's too bad. I feel bad because I know he wanted to contribute. Are there any last thoughts from anyone else? I think Rustam was here. Rustam Sirat was here, who is another important voice. For Hazaras. No last thoughts. Okay, I'm putting my email because I promised that. Well, if there's no other thoughts, okay. Hussein Ali, do you want to ask a question or contribute anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize the point that Bismillah Al-Zada was saying. So I think one of the most challenging part is like lack of understanding the situation without the documentation. For example, during the first period of Taliban, Fuladi, which is a part of central district of Bamiyan province, which my relatives lives there. So my mother comes from Fuladi. So at least every family had lost one of their member. For example, me myself, I have 5 relatives who was lost their life and killed directly by the Taliban in the first period of Taliban. But no one talks. I never heard or never read anything that what was happening in Fuladi. And also the Shahidan, which I myself come from. Shahidan is another valley, which is a vast valley that is almost a district. All the houses were burned, people were killed in their houses. Even staple was not spared. So when we were coming back, we had not have even a stable to put shelter for the animals. So in this way, you can see the severity of the crimes. So I mean, if there is enough evidence so this showing something that yeah, there are happening things that maybe we didn't see and that what they were intending. So yeah, I mean documentation is very important.
Thank you so much for that contribution. I mean, I think you're right. I think that, you know, there have been kind of more attention focused on a few of the more large scale attacks that happened against Hazaras surrounding the first Taliban period, such as Mazar-e-Sharif or Yakolang, but you know, like equally devastating to communities that you mentioned, Shaidan, Fuladi, Saroseo, directly outside of Bamiyan. You know, these places are not mentioned, and yet, I mean, you know, this is where I did my research, and I did speak directly with survivors, and you know, visited memorials and grave sites, and it's it's a very good point, right? That I think the kind of full picture of what happened to these communities kind of hasn't been systematically documented, or is maybe not readily available. And that might be something that can be improved upon. I try to give space to that in my research, and so that there is at least a publication out there, right, that then can be referred back to. So my own work, if anybody kind of wants to connect that, I'm happy to try to kind of underline the parts that do mention that. And I'm sure maybe some of our other guests or speakers have also you know, written about and documented that in some way. But thank you so much for sharing. And I understand, you know, again, how frustrating it can be that not only have communities and individuals gone through these, you know, traumatic events, but then to kind of have lack of recognition is you know, making that trauma all the worse. So thank you. Does anyone else want to contribute anything, or? No? Well, then we can go ahead and close. Again, thank you so much to our speakers. I greatly appreciate you taking the time to contribute and to even go over the timeline that we promised. And thank you also to everyone who offered such valuable insights and contributions from the listeners. You know, take care. You know, I hope that this has been useful in our efforts to try to continue to work towards documentation. And you know, there'll never be a resolution, but perhaps some sort of movement towards justice for Hazaras, for, you know, Afghan women, for, you know, other ethnic and religious minorities in Afghanistan. So thank you very much. Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.